There's prediction that, or they've come out to talk about, PRC has talked about the fact that utility tariffs will go up in January as well. How's the weight of tariffs in your competition?
I don't remember the weight
not the exact
of
numbers,
head,
yeah.
but I'm pretty happy with how the conversation is evolving. We have in the past looked at macroeconomic variables in isolation. And it's one of the reasons why we are setting up the public policy unit. And what we should be thinking about is from the global point of view. And one of the things we're going to do by the end of the first quarter next year is to really talk about our trade vulnerabilities as a country. If you look at our major importer, where we import our commodities from in terms of country, and where we export our commodities, so we're currently looking at a data set that is pointing to about 25% of our exports going to India and about 30% of our imports coming from China. You cannot have a conversation on inflation exchange rate without thinking about these two main things. Because if you are exporting to a country that is also having exchange rate challenges, and you are importing to a country that may be having or may not be having exchange rate challenges, its effect on your currency or your inflation, it's also questionable. And that is why we need to look at all the macroeconomic variables and see what exactly is happening. We could be seeing a slowdown in inflation, but at the expense of another macroeconomic variable.
Interesting. Let me come back to the question of you've talked about going to your website and doing a personal calculation of inflation. Who has the mandate when it comes to calculation of inflation? Can everybody do that? So today, Jojo, if you can wake up and say that I think inflation is 200%. What does the law say? Help us out when it comes to calculating inflation, and whose word we trust, just like what it said in the Bible?
I mean,
who should have the final authority?
It's Ghana Statistical Service, and the law is very clear on that. The Statistical Service.
George cannot come out tomorrow and say that I think inflation is 300% in Ghana.
No, let me explain it. So you can say that based on some other argument of freedom of speech
modeling,
or
I have a
whatever.
modeling that I can.
You can say that.
What you put out.
You see, it's exactly the reason why we are pushing the conversation around the National Statistical System. I don't know if you heard it. In November, we inaugurated the National Statistics Advisory Committee, which is made up of 25 players within, stakeholders in the National Statistical System. And one of their core mandates is designating statistics as official and designating statistics as experimental. Because we've come up with a data quality assurance framework where every statistic that you want to use for national policy, you can come out and say that you have calculated inflation of 3,000%, but it wouldn't be an official statistic. It would only become an official statistic if government recognizes it and government works with it.
But aren't you worried? I mean, aren't you worried for you as a statistician, and maybe you don't care that you've come out with the data, looking at the kind of work that goes into how rigorous your data is. Everybody is punching holes, and that's not you as a person, the service. Aren't you worried because of the kind of work goes through, the sleepless nights? And Jojo Afe comes out and says that inflation is 300%. Kwame Mensah somewhere in maybe Stellenbosch University says that inflation is 400%. Isn't that a concern to the service itself?
I would not really see that as a problem, to be honest with you.
No.
And this is partly because of my background as an academic. You need to allow people to have diversities in terms of approaches in calculating a particular statistic.
The experience of questioning the work that Statistical Service does.
The beauty about it is that it gives us the opportunity to further explain. You see, it becomes problematic if Ghana Statistical Service decides to operate in a non-transparent way. And the first thing we did in 2019 was to make sure that our methodological guide for the computation of CPI is out there. For everybody.
Can I get that access to it? Everybody can walk onto your website
and get it.
Get access on how you calculate inflation.
Exactly.
The modeling is transparent, it's out there.
Exactly. And that's what I'm saying, that we even put the disaggregated data out there. For issues of anonymity and things like that, we don't put the prices of the outlets and so on and so forth. But we have different levels that we can make the data accessible to you, and you can calculate what you want to calculate and benchmark it with what you think you are doing. So it's important for people to come up with it, people to understand what goes into it, people to appreciate the international standards, and then we can move on as a country. But once we decide to cover up, operate in a black box, then there are concerns.
You believe that your system is very robust, transparent, and reflects the issues or the developments on the ground when it comes to your national inflation data?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is why at a point where the rates were going up and people were speculating that it should be higher than what we are releasing or it should be lower than what we are releasing, we took it upon ourselves to educate persons in Ghana on what goes into the computation. You can decide to use different approaches, that is fine. But as a country, we need to decide which approach we want to use. And we've gone in for the approach that is recommended by the International Labour Organization. Through the Consumer Price Index, collect data on a monthly basis, use your weights based on Living Standard Survey, and compute your inflation.